Go. Okay, just putting up a couple verses that may be encouraging as I was praying and getting ready for this session. Ephesians 2:13 says, "Now in Christ Jesus, you who previously were far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ." And I think of myself, a Muslim background. I was born and raised Muslim. My dad is from Iran. My mom is a Midwestern girl, and we lived in Iran when I was small. I came to faith in Jesus as a college student in New York State and in a place called Binghamton, New York, where I met my wife Annette. And God, I'm probably one of the few people in the world that got their life call out of Genesis chapter 3, because those of you that know your Bibles, I guess in Grand Rapids, you're born, it's with mother's milk and all that. It's our first time in Grand Rapids, so we're maybe influenced by stereotypes, but positive ones. And in Genesis 3:23, God sent Adam out of the garden to cultivate the ground from which he had been taken. And when I was a very young believer with On Fire Christians, I received the call of God to be involved in ministry from the ground from which I was taken, and that was a Muslim ground. And for those of you that have been in this kind of field of ministry for a while, it's exactly as Brother Adam said. In many ways it's somewhat thankless work, or it can be difficult plowing, but I just want to thank you on behalf of all the CMBs here and the others that are not here. Your efforts have not been in vain, and your continued efforts will be fruitful in the Lord. So thank you for putting up with whatever you have put up with, and I know some have been in the field for many a year, many a decade. The next verse here, I was just thinking of the end of this verse, but the full verse, it's during that Jerusalem council where they're trying to bring the Gentiles into the kingdom, and they're having a bit of a debate about that. And James, the leader of the Jerusalem church, a brother of Jesus, at a certain point in their deliberations, it says, after they had stopped speaking, James answered, saying, "Brethren, listen to me. Simeon," that's Simon Peter, "has related how God first concerned himself about taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name." And it seems like in the time we live, we are seeing that God has concerned himself for taking, for the glory of Jesus Christ, a people from Muslim backgrounds, from so many nations, so many cultures, ethnic groups. It's not uniform across every Muslim people group, but in many Muslim people groups, God has truly been moving. And we see it's because of the concern of God, even as James says here, the concern of God. It's so heartwarming. Now let me lay out a little bit where this is going. If you're expecting, fiery, oratorical Western Michigan preaching, people tell me I'm much more of a teacher, and coming into this, I'm going to try to at least move a little to, give some kind of a mirage of charisma. But I will try to at least not speak in a monotone. And what we'll look at is global trends, global trends, qualitative, and some of the causes of the global trends, the legacy missionaries, prayer initiatives, rise of theocratic Islam, and current missionary work, and CMB witness, and then future thoughts. So that's the outline. The first bit here is that we can see today that Christianity, worship of Jesus Christ, is growing in Muslim contexts, even in the midst of persecution. Actually, this book, and again, like some of the other authors, I'm a bit sheepish and embarrassed to even present books. I was thinking like 5, 6, 7 years ago, because many of us are now involved with discipleship of Muslim background believers, to provide discipleship materials for them, and they're a big element of life for CMBs is persecution. But as I started writing this book in 2020, I saw all kinds of challenges afflicting the Western church. So I broadened the book out to picking up key storylines, not just for CMBs, but also for people living in the good old USA, Canada, Australia, England, Scotland, where you would have hardly thought a couple decades ago the challenges that we're facing, we would be facing as we have even now. So in the Muslim context, the church is growing, and don't be if you're serving in a context where there isn't yet a breakthrough, or they don't have a major indigenous church, don't feel bad. As Sister Ishik had said this morning in her session, don't compare, because as soon as you start comparing, then you feel either superior, inferior, and even Paul talks about that. So just to encourage you, God is moving. Now, the text here, I hope is it big enough to see? Yeah, I think so, good. A lot of us here that have been involved with missiology, missions training, etc., we have a bit of a natural and probably well-warranted suspicion about numbers. At least very much, if not an outright suspicion, at least a concern to try to find out, what exactly is true. And, when we spoke of in some of the sessions, and you hear some of the people that we've heard these great sessions about dishonesty in the Muslim world and things of that sort, and Muhammad's example, we would have to be very careful even in our missions work to try to get accurate count. And sometimes there's talks of great numbers of Muslims coming to faith that are almost hard to believe. Is it a case of double counting? And so this idea of quantitative can be a little bit hard to arrive at. And in many of the contexts, like Iran, for example, no one really knows how many Muslim background believers there are, or CMBs in the country, because the church is primarily underground and there aren't censuses or registration lists of believers from Muslim background. So it would be estimates. Well, a number of years ago, in the last decade, Patrick Johnstone of Operation World, teaming up with another researcher, Dwayne Miller, they tried to come up with a global census of Christians of Muslim background, and they published that in 2015 based on the best available reports. So they didn't actually go out and try to count heads, but they culled the best available reports that they could find, and they felt that a good estimate for the year 2010 was about 10 million Muslim background believers, but it could be as many as 15 million or as low as 5, because there's just the margin of error would be very big on this type of. And if you look at their, they give a country by country breakdown. Now, we shouldn't really miss the forest for the trees, or however they say that, because, not to nitpick exactly what it is, we know there's a big margin in what the exact number is that's probably only known by God. The encouraging thing is that the trend lines from 1960, when they picked it up, where there was really not a statistically significant number of Muslims that have come to faith, but initially Indonesia started getting more and more believers from Muslim background. If any of you read Like a Mighty Wind by Mel Terry and so forth. In the 90s, Iran started really breaking open with some martyrdoms, several of them of Christian background pastors who laid down their lives for Muslim people, and a revival started coming to Iran, and has also come to many other countries, as we've heard in the testimonials and in the workshops, etc. So very encouraging trends. The trend lines are good. Now, about a month ago, I called up, or I communicated by email with Dwayne Miller, and I said, Dwayne, I'm giving this workshop. Do you guys get any updates? Well, he goes, he checked in with Patrick Johnson. Patrick is kind of semi-retired or something of that sort. And Jason Mandrick, who does the Operation World now, was getting married. So he said, Jason is not up to taking on such a monumental task. And so we don't have updated numbers on a global basis. So that's all we've got right now. But so the good news is, whereas, say, 50, 60 years ago, in the lifetime of many of us here, there were very, very few MBBs, and you would find many countries, even in Operation World, where it was said, Mauritania, no known believers, Saudi Arabia, no known believers, Albania, 4 believers, and now God has moved to the point where things are growing. So that's encouraging. What could be discouraging is that the number of Muslims in the world, the gross number of Muslims, has far exceeded these numbers, such that the number of lost Muslims in the world is yet increasing. So our mission field is still in front of us significantly, whether that's here in the U.S. or for the four corners of the world. I was reading, some of you have probably read, there's two charts here. One is the persecution watch list on the left that Open Doors puts that out every year. They just updated in the last couple months to 2022. And interestingly, for the first time since I can remember, North Korea was supplanted as the number one persecutor country by Afghanistan. And, that's kind of tragic in a way after so many years of Western involvement in the country, that country now is considered by Open Doors as the number one persecuting country. And there's 7 of the top 10. You'll see Muslim countries: Somalia, Libya, Yemen, Nigeria, Pakistan, Iran, where there's Muslim inflicted persecution of Christians and churches. That is not new. If you go back year after year to that list, you'll find like 35 or more of the top 50 countries are Muslim countries. So by far the greatest persecution of Christians in the world is happening at the hands of Muslims or Islamic states. But on the right list, and this is a little dated now, the Ministry of Operation World, they put out a list of the fastest growing evangelical churches by percentage. So not by gross numbers, but by percentage. And they found that Iran was number 1, Afghanistan 2, the Gambia 3, and so forth. Greenland, of course, very small country. And you'll see the list there. The interesting thing is that I said, wow, this is kind of interesting. 7 out of the top 10 persecuting countries are Muslim countries, not a surprise. But 7 out of the 10 fastest growing evangelical church growth rate countries in the world are also Muslim countries, which would be a pretty big surprise. And now, of course, the numbers are a bit dated now. I think they're almost a decade old. And Afghanistan, we know, has lost a lot of CMBs because they have moved out of the country or some have been killed. But the general idea is that, wow, in some of these Muslim countries, the church is growing. And this is something for which we need to thank God for. At the same time, I was doing some historical research, and a church historian said that to the best of their estimating, the church from the inception of Jesus Christ and the apostles, day of Pentecost, etc., it grew by 40% a year globally, the universal church, for 300 years. The first 300 years of the church grew 40% a year because of the amazing dynamic, ministry of those who went out right from the book of Acts and onward and reached the whole world. So good things are happening. Good things are happening, and yet more work is needed. Now, if we say, some of us, I don't want to go into the weeds, into tangential arguments or discussions per se, and if they come up during the Q&A, we'll do our best to. But, we've heard sometimes with these things called insider movements with, very inflated numbers of people that nobody can confirm. 500,000 people got saved in Bangladesh and no one can find any of them, right? And that type of thing, I'm not laughing to be incredulous. It's just there was a lot of smoke and mirrors with numbers, or at least hard to confirm. So not just the quantitative would be important, but the qualitative. And I think from a point of view of an MBB myself, and from the point of view of hearing a CMB myself, and hearing some of these amazing testimonies we've been hearing, both in the plenary with Abdu and with some of the workshops we've heard. Brother Wissam's testimony was amazing. Ishik this morning was amazing. I haven't been able to get to all of the testimonials, but what we see is a quality. There is a quality of leadership, a quality of spirituality and godliness that is coming up to the surface through the ministry of people like you, through the investment, the discipleship. Brother Steve Kelly this morning was talking about discipleship in the Middle East. So heartwarming. And a lot of labor, a lot of, what we would say the spiritual equivalent of changing dirty diapers and cleaning up scraped knees and all of the heartache that goes with people backsliding and so forth. But the fruit is coming, and we're seeing a quality thanks to people like you. My wife and I, each of part of the last 4 years, we've been teaching in Albania, which is a lot different than Saudi Arabia, but it's a country where the church is above ground, and so the leaders have allowed us to share some certain things. And we have Brother Roland is here from Albania, and he's sitting here somewhere, but I don't know exactly where. There he is. And so we just got to meet him yesterday or today, this morning actually, and said, wow. And so it's great at a place like this to get this kind of connectivity. But just a few words of encouragement from Albania. And brother, during the comments time, if you want to add or subtract, you can do that. Albania is a country that was for about 500 years under the Turkish Ottoman rule, and there was an Islamization process there that happened through the incentivization of the Ottomans, such that about maybe 60 or 70% of the population became Muslims. By and large, the Albanian people did not like a very strict Sunni Islam, so many of them became Bektashi Muslims, which is kind of a mixture between Shiism and Sufism, and they follow the 12 Imams, but they're very, very tolerant, and so it fit the people very well. Now, sadly, after the Ottoman period ended in the early, about 100 years ago, then Albania fell under a very harsh communist dictatorship under Enver Hoxha, which really suppressed the church and all kinds of churches, Orthodox, Catholic, and the Muslims as well, under that kind of a harsh communist dictatorship. At the top, we're with Pastor Gazim Spahia and his wife Ariana. They're the president of Assemblies of God of Albania. And he was telling some stories that when communism fell and the first believers were won by missionary efforts, there were only 4 known believers in the country. And he was telling us the story that if they would get a scrap of a piece of a Bible in Italian, there was nothing in Albanian, they would voraciously devour it. Any kind of commentary, a booklet in French, somebody would know that language, and they would voraciously, train themselves. And Pastor Gazim, he went to Italy for Bible college, and said it was very difficult. And now he's one of the leaders in the church, and they have a Bible college that my wife and I teach at. On your left, that is the Bektashi World Center in Tirana. We took our students there, and they're very hospitable as far as welcoming visitors. That's the World Center. They were kicked out of Turkey by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in the 1920s because he wanted to keep it to Sunni Islam. The headquarters were in Turkey, and they brought it over to Albania. And actually, we were teaching the students some Arabic songs. One was an Arabic kind of a chant worship song, and we went in there, and I asked the people, "Can we sing in here?" And they said, "Okay." And so the students were singing in Arabic in the mosque. We considered it almost a form of worship and also spiritual worship, spiritual warfare. On the right, my wife Annette and I, we were with Pastor Fatyon Kadiu and his wife Miranda. His father was an Islamic judge. You Arabic speakers will know the name Qadi. Kadiu is coming from that Arabic word. And, it's so exciting to be around these Albanians because they're, and Brother Roland is here. Maybe he doesn't want his name on the recording, but anyway, they see the gospel as being on the front foot. Here in the States, we've been so much under attack. And so Pastor Fatyon was telling us, when they first got saved in those early days in the 90s, they had no resources, no booklets, nothing. So they would go on these buses, and the Albanian buses are very crowded. And one Christian brother would go in the front and one go in the back, and he'd say, and I would yell to my brother, "Hey Joe, have you read the Bible?" And he would yell from the back of the bus, "No, what does the Bible say?" It would say, "Have you heard of John 3:16? And so they would do this evangelism from the front of the back of the bus, yelling so all the people could hear the gospel. And then he would say, after some of the Muslims would say, "You shouldn't do that." But other people said, "No, what you're saying is right." And so we see the gospel growing in that country. And now they're sending out even some CMB, missionaries that are going to other parts of the Balkans and other places. And not only, numbers, but we see the depth. We see the spirituality, the Bible, hunger for the Bible, commitment to missionary training, commitment to, and we see missionaries there working from places like Nigeria, Brazil, Finland, the States, Korea, etc., working together with Albanian leadership to bring forth a generation of believers. So certainly there's the challenges, like in any context, but God is certainly moving. Let's go now to the global trends. One of the things that this conference focuses on, and we could say, how is this happening, that Muslims are coming to faith in Jesus? Why is this happening? Well, legacy missionaries. I'll just mention these very, very briefly. Some of you might know Raymond Lull. He was considered by many, he was a contemporary of the Crusaders. He went to North Africa to preach the gospel. He ended up getting martyred in Bijaya, Algeria in 1315, but his life and his writings created a interest in Islam in the introduction of Middle Eastern languages into many universities in Europe. By the way, you can get the PowerPoint from me or from the Horizons people, and these quotes and so forth and so on. It's not a problem to have them in your possession. Here's a quote from the book of George Otis, The Last of the Giants. I don't know if any of you remember this book. It's a couple decades old. But Otis wrote, in the 1980s, a truly remarkable incident took place in Bijaya, in Algeria. On one unforgettable night, with no prior warning and for no immediate discernible reason, God sovereignly descended upon his coastal town with gracious bounty, moving from house to house and communicating through a combination of dreams, visions, and angelic visitations. He did not rest until every member of this Muslim community was properly introduced to his only begotten son, Jesus. As might be expected, came daybreak. Nearly every townsperson had a story to tell. As the Holy Spirit lingered and these simple citizens managed to piece together the magnitude of what had happened to them, a sense of spiritual awe settled over the entire town. And I know from Annette and I served with SAT-7 in the Middle East, and from that time even till now, Algeria has been a country where God has really moved. Now, if Raymond Lull can look down from heaven or wherever, he would probably be thankful and he would be amazed that God has moved in that country where he went to serve. For the Iranian and even the Pakistanis, Afghans, there's a great appreciation for Henry Martin, who went, you can see his years, only lived 31 years, died, was very poor in health when he went to the field, but his mind and his spirit were as strong as his body was frail. He was able to translate the New Testament into Urdu and into Persian before he died, and he's much beloved by Iranians who recently celebrated the 200th anniversary of his death by publishing his memoirs in Persian. His diary, I guess it would be. Zwemer, I don't have to say much. You have an amazing testimonial in biography in your booklet there. The Apostle to Islam, 100 years ago, he and his colleagues, they really started positioning the church to engage Islam and Muslims in the area of ideas and beliefs. And the list of people that were contemporary to him, such as William Sinclair Tisdale, are really luminary, and I want to just call out with thanks, Adam Simnowitz has actually scanned in a lot of the early writings, both of Zwemer and others, that are making it available. And if you read it, it's so much deeper than most of the average missiological fanfare that we read in terms of the depth, the knowledge, the commitment that these people had to love and understand the people and to equip the church to engage Islam in the area of comparative religions and beliefs. So we have much to be thankful for and grateful for these people. In terms of compassion ministries, much mercy ministry has happened in the Muslim world. This is Lillian Trasher, who went to Egypt. I'll read this. Arrived in 1910, arriving in Asyut, Egypt. Lillian soon met a man who came to the nearby mission house seeking someone to attend to a dying woman nearby. Lillian and an older woman named Selah went to see the woman, who died shortly after they arrived, but left them her malnourished baby girl clinging to life. When they arrived, their Arabic translator told Miss Trasher that the old woman then holding the baby, its grandmother, planned to throw it into the great river Nile. At the thought of this, Lillian Trasher could not leave the baby, whom she named Farida. Thus she began an orphanage. By the turn of 1918, the orphanage had grown to 50 children and 8 widows. Lillian Trasher worked 50 years among Egypt's orphans and other forgotten people from 1911 to 1961 without furlough, including through the Nazi occupation. By the time she finished her ministry in 1961 and went to be with the Lord, they had 1,200 orphans there. And she was known as beloved Mother of the Nile and is buried at the orphanage that bears her name. And you could see from when she was a young woman who went to the mission field to her later days, she served the Lord and has such a legacy in that country. And many, many, many other people have served. Most are unheralded, most are not well known, but God is using people, and God is using, I know some of you even are preparing now to go to the Muslim world. We'll look now at another major cause of, I think, revival in the Muslim world is prayer initiatives. And you see, there's quite a lot of them. I picked a few that I'm familiar with, and many of the ministries, like, for example, Horizons, Open Doors, 30 Days of Prayer, some of the Ramadan prayer focuses. The ministry we're involved with, Global Initiative, has a prayer ministry that 60,000 people are involved with, praying for Muslims. So we are thankful, all of the CMBs, because somebody has been praying for us. Somebody has laboring, interceding for Muslim background people, and God is bringing the fruit. We cannot overlook the importance of the prayer initiatives that have happened, and we're so thankful for those who are praying. God is answering prayers, and certainly continual intercession is needed to keep the work going forward. In about 5 minutes, we'll get ready for questions, so you can be thinking of those. What else is happening? Well, part of the silver lining of all the rise of ISIS theocratic Islam is that there's a spiritual harvest going on in the other direction. So the cartoon here, or the illustration that someone has made, is showing that Muslims are wrestling with the concept of Islamic government. Islam traditionally does not separate the mosque from the state, so they're experimenting between autocracy, which would be like kings and monarchs, or democracy or theocracy. Now, what we have is, if you study here, I think in Grand Rapids, you have Christian universities and seminaries, which I know there are numbers of them, and you would maybe study all kinds of Bible commentaries, Matthew Henry and down the line, right? Well, the Muslims have a very rich tradition of Islamic commentary. The word for commentary is tafsir, and you have very famous ones like Al-Badawi, Zamakhshari, Tafsir al-Jalalain, Arabic commentaries, and other language commentaries that Muslims have made to describe the Quran and explain it. But something very interesting has happened in the last few decades particularly, is that in the places the Muslims have gotten complete political control, and they are essentially saying, we are establishing, in other words, the kingdom of God on earth. We're using the Sharia law. We're essentially bringing heaven to earth. Well, those are the places that Muslims are just scurrying to get away from. This is pretty profound, and basically, Brother Abdu was talking about this when he said many Muslims have become agnostics, and they're struggling between Sharia law on one hand and what they see as kind of an inferior religion of Christianity on the other. But we see here that, that's al-Baghdadi when he was in the great mosque of Mosul in Iraq, declaring the beginning of the caliphate in ISIS, Dawlat al-Islamiyya. And so many millions of people couldn't wait to get, and they would risk their lives. You saw all these horrific and sad, tragic pictures of people taking rafts out into the oceans, kind of get to Greece, Athens, wherever they could get, to get away from Dawlat al-Islamiyya, the Islamic State. And most of these were Muslim people, and many had been persecuted harshly. It's quite telling, actually, if we look at that from a wider perspective. If we look at Afghanistan, the Taliban, literally the students of the Quran, and they came back into power in August, and they had been in power before. Again, Afghans leaving the country in the hundreds of thousands. Now, some may say, well, they were politically needing to leave the country, but you saw the pictures of people hanging off of airplanes, risking almost certain death just to get away from a society that would be built on the Sharia. I mean, this is profound from the point of view of Christian missiology. Iran, another situation where Ayatollah Khomeini came in 1979, kind of lied to the people about his true motivations and said, we are going to have a pure society, pakeh, based on the Sharia law of God, and this has turned off Muslims to Islam like nothing else. And so you have this great movement of Iranians to the gospel, but many others have become depressed, suicidal, drug addicted, just trying to escape a terribly distorted world under theocracy. We see many Muslims are reevaluating Islam, like Wafa Sultan, there's Musab Hassan Youssef, and others. These are just a few illustrations of Muslims that are saying, hey, wow, is this really the way? Is this really the truth? And so many are leaving Islam. We come just toward the end here. There is amazing missionary work happening. I can't adequately do justice to it, but I can say that many Muslim background believers or CMBs are being trained up by missionaries. On the bottom left there you see Brother Rashid, and he was sharing with a group of us with Jesus for Muslims Network in Metro New York a few years back, and he was saying, there was a missionary who came to Morocco, and in the face of so many testimonies now of people seeing thousands and thousands and thousands of people and creating these rapid church planting movements and all this, and this missionary had only led 2 people to the Lord. Well, in 20 years. Well, one of them was Brother Rashid. So, and he said this man's investment in his life was very thorough. Next to him, you see Rashid Sudman. Her father was martyred in Iran in the 90s, a CMB himself. And yet his daughter continued on in the ministry. Brother Hussein Andarius from Afghanistan, amazing testimony. And of course, you'll recognize the late great Brother Nabil Qureshi. I put these pictures up because these are public people, and it's no problem. Their pictures are all over the internet. But there are many other unsung and unheralded CMBs that are quietly and effectively and contagiously sharing the gospel with Jesus Christ in many contexts. Future thoughts, I'll end this and then we'll go to questions. One of the things we're looking at is these ideas of Islamic movements. Southeast Asia now, which historically hasn't been, the bastion of Sharia, is now either under jeopardy of Sharia law, under threat of more and more Muslim money coming from Saudi Arabia and other places. And they are, even in the Balkans actually, there's a lot of money coming from Saudi and Turkey, and they're trying to re-Islamicize or bring Salafist Islam there. It was mentioned about by Brother Josh McDowell the other night that usury is considered interest on Islamic, is not considered Islamic finance. And I was just happening prior to that when I was making this. President Erdogan of Turkey is really trying to tack more in the direction of an Islamic Islamization process. And so even though Turkey historically in the last 100 years hasn't been that kind of a state, it's interesting to see what is going to happen with Turkey. One thing we do know is wherever the governments and the leadership move toward Islamization, there is a significant subset of Muslims that get very disillusioned with Islam and become open to the gospel. So I conclude with this last slide. Is that we observe encouraging trends. In some countries, like Iran, the stigma of leaving Islam has been broken, and this is massive, and that's probably one of the main things that can be said about the movement of Iranians to Christ is the stigma and the shame of leaving Islam is broken. And many Iranians now, when they hear even a family member has left Islam, they will say, good for you. I'm glad you were brave enough to act on your convictions. Just watch out for the government and stuff. But there's no you're a pollute, you're a shame, you're a reject for leaving Islam. And so we're seeing this increasingly because certain brave ones have stepped forward. Some have met prison, some have met death, some have met all kinds of persecution, but yet God has moved in these countries. So we see encouraging trends. I'm very, very encouraged overall what we have in the future of the Muslim world. A big need for discipleship, big need for Christian ministry. I wouldn't concentrate on throwing up big numbers, even in my own life. If I can touch a few people that give themselves to Jesus, that can make a difference, we'll continue to see great ripple effects.